This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is June 25th, 1970. I'm in the office of Norick Brothers Company, and I'm interviewing Mr. Roy Evans, who is the advertising manager for Norick Brothers and who is one of the old-time advertising men in the state of Oklahoma and in Oklahoma City. Mr. Evans, I wonder if, to start off with, if you would tell us a little about your parentage, where your parents are from, who your parents were, and when you came to Oklahoma.
Ken, my parents were John Evans and Mary Evans. We came from Texas to Oklahoma in 1902. That was before Oklahoma was a state, of course. We settled on a farm in Pottawatomie County, where I stayed until about 1906, when I returned to Texas to go to school. And after my schooling there, I returned to Oklahoma in 1910 to go to work for the John Deere Plow Company in Oklahoma City.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about farming in Pottawatomie County about 1902? A little bit about what it was like during that period.
Farming in those days was a pretty strenuous outfit. The land was new, the country was new. We farmed with mules and horses. There was no motor equipment, no tractors, anything like that. We just plowed with turning plows, double shovels, and bull shovels, we call them. And lots of the land was new ground, we called it, where it had been cleared away. The trees had been cleared and it's full of stumps and grubs and so forth. And it took a real sturdy fellow to hit those stumps and plow all day under those conditions. Most of the farms were small, of course. A man could take a mule and double shovel plow in those days and make a living for his family on 80 acres. And it didn't require the tremendous investment that farming today requires. But we all managed to get along, live happily, and have a good time.
You talk about double shovels and bull shovels and other types. Could you describe what that means?
Well, what we called a double shovel was a plow pulled by one animal, and it had two shovels, two turning points. And the bull, what we called a bull shovel, was a big wide plow that we went right down the middle of the rows and plowed out the middles, just using one animal.
Could you describe Shawnee during the period around 1902? Apparently you lived close to Shawnee.
Shawnee was a pretty wild town, I'd say, in those days. I remember one time when I was a youngster going to Shawnee, and the only three-story building at that time, had a saloon on the main floor, had a gambling house on the second floor, and a bawdy house on the third floor. And of course that was a railroad town. There were a lot of railroad men there. And not being very far from Indian Territory, Shawnee was in Oklahoma Territory, which was supposed to be dry. That is, we had no liquor there. We had liquor in Oklahoma Territory, but in the Indian Territory there was no liquor, or it wasn't supposed to be. So a lot of those boys would come in from the Indian Territory over to Shawnee for their liquid refreshments. Sometimes they'd get pretty wild before they got out, and we had lots of excitement in those days. Lots of the boys got thrown into jugs, into the coolers, and we had lots of fights among the folks who came in, and it was really a pretty wild situation.
What was the size of Shawnee at
As I recollect, the Shawnee must have been about 8 or 9,000.
Did they have any industries at that time?
Well, the Rock Island Roundhouse was there, and it employed several hundred men as the main industry. And they had a mill, which is still going and still prosperous. It was there at that time.
Is that what's now the Shawnee Milling Company?
That's now the Shawnee Milling Company.
What was it called then?
Well, as I recollect, it was Shawnee Milling Company at that time. I'm not certain about the title of that. But those are two industries that I remember about the town.
And you left from there and went back to Texas. And
I went back to Texas to go to school in Dallas. And after I finished school in Dallas, I went to work with the Southern Pacific Railroad at Houston, Texas. And after a short time there, I came to Oklahoma City to work for the John Deere Plow Company.
what year was that?
That was 1910.
And what were you doing with John Deere?
I was secretary to the sales manager of the John Deere Plow Company.
Could you tell us a little about Oklahoma City in 1910?
In 1910, the Concord building, I believe, was the highest building in town. It had been finished a few months before that time, and it likewise was a frontier town. More or less frontier spirit prevailed here, and it was a situation of where people, everyone knew each other, everyone was friendly, everyone was helpful toward his fellow man, and it was a great spirit and a great place to live, and it was the laying of the foundation of the things that have made Oklahoma City the great city it is today.
Who were the civic leaders, as you recall, in Shawnee at that time? I mean, Oklahoma City at that time.
Well, Mr. Ed Overholser was one. Mr. Henry Overholser, his father, was a little bit before that time, I believe, and Charlie Concord had been one of the main law officers here. I remember them, and I don't recall offhand who some of the rest of them were, but there were a number of them. If I could see their names, I could remember them, and of course we all knew each other, and everyone mostly knew each other in those days.
Could you describe Oklahoma City as far as industries were concerned in 1910? What were the main industries then?
Well, as I recall, they were selling lots out here to get the packing houses in Oklahoma City. And there was a big lot sale going on out in the southwest part of town, raise money to promote the packing plants, and that's how they came in here about that time, and maybe a year or two after that. And there was 2 or 3 mills here, flour mills, ice plants, and other industries of that kind, and there was some railroad yard here also at that time.
Can you think of any industries there then that are there now? Some of the older properties that are still existing.
Well, some of the packing plants are still here, and of course, in 1910 is when this business where you are here now, the Norick Brothers, began in 1910, and they are the only printing house in Oklahoma City who is still here under the same management as was at that time.
How did it begin?
It began at a very small printing place down on California Street, a little board building, shack, you might say, and on one side of the little shack building was this little printing place, and on the other side of the partition, which ran in between down the center of the building, was a blacksmith and horse shoeing shop. And those two businesses, again, started down there side by east in this little board shack down on California, what is California Street. It was a rather interesting thing to note that both of those buildings began there side by side in 1910, and both of them were affected by a new and a giant industry which was just being born. Norick Brothers became large and big and grew to a nationwide, you might say a worldwide printing institution because of the automobile business, because Norick specialized in automotive printing for automobile dealers. And of course the automobiles put the horse shoeing man out of business. He went the way of the dodo. But that's an interesting thing to think about, Ken, that there they were, side by side, beginning in a raw, rugged, wild country, you might say, and both of them, their destiny was determined by a young giant which was just then beginning to come up over the horizon. He was called the automotive industry. The horse shoeing fellow went out of business, of course.
Yes.
And Norick grew and grew and grew.
By the automobile business that caused the other one to go out.
Yeah, the automobile killed one of them and built the other one.
Can you think of any other industries that started back in that early period that are grown from? I think of I don't know what the period of time, but Mecklenburg, Duncan, and certain others started with small shops. Can you think of some of the small shops that have become large industries here?
Well, I don't think of any right offhand, but I do think of some of the banks here, of course, that started in a very small way about that time and have grown into great financial institutions.
Tell about some of them.
Well, some of them have changed their names. There's the First National and the old Farmers National here has changed its name. It was a very early day bank, and some of the rest of them came along later, of course.
What during this early period, 1910 to 1913, 15, what outstanding events occurred in Oklahoma City that you witnessed and can think of?
Well, 1910 to 19 and 13 to 15. I don't recall what year it was that Teddy Roosevelt ran for president. It was somewhere along in there. On the Bull Moose ticket, he came to Oklahoma City and had a big parade down Broadway. And I got out right in the middle of the street, right in front of Teddy's car. He was standing up in the car waving his hat, bowing and so forth, right in the middle of the street, right in front of him, and took a Kodak picture of him. I was probably 20 feet ahead of his car. Well, you know, a fellow couldn't do that nowadays. He'd be grabbed by the Secret Service. He even started out that way. But I still have that Kodak picture, and of course I kept it as a souvenir, and I'm very proud of it. At that time, Teddy's private car was parked about where the present courthouse stands. That was the old Frisco Depot side. At that time, there's where you, when he got ready to leave town that evening after his speech, there's where he boarded his train. I recall that incident happening about that time. Of course, there were many others, and about 1915 was when the state capitol was built, I believe, around about that time. And I have Kodak pictures I took of the capitol in various stages of construction.
You joined the advertising club about that time. I wonder, and I understand that that of course the advertising club was one of the largest, most influential clubs and civic organizations in Oklahoma City during the earlier period when there were very few of the civic organizations that exist today. Can you tell me something about the Oklahoma City Advertising Club at the time you joined its leadership and some of the things it did?
About the time I joined the club, Joe Dawson was president at the time. It was the leading club in Oklahoma City. Practically every head of every business in town, Mr. Petty of the Petty Hardware Store, Mr. Gaylord, Mr. Parker of the Oklahoma News, and Mr. John A. Brown, and practically all the businessmen in Oklahoma City belonged to the advertising club. Later, of course, these other clubs came along, Rotary and Kiwanis and so forth, and but in those early days, the ad club was the club that most everyone belonged to.
Could you tell some of the activity of the club during the early period?
Well, I remember we were pretty active. Every fellow was pretty active in the club, and we pulled a lot of stunts and did a lot of things. I remember one time we pulled what we called a Hamburg Circus out on West Main Street, about where downtown Chevrolet is now. There was a vacant lot, and we set up a big circus tent and pulled what we call a Hamburg Circus, the purpose of which was to raise money for the club. Various members of the club acted the parts in the circus. We had rigged us up various trapezes and things, and had a lot of fun and had a big crowd. And of course, we ran for 2 or 3 nights, and raised considerable money. And then later along, the Depression came, and we pulled a stunt in the advertising club. We were going to bury Old Man Gloom, as we called him, trying to stir up a little interest and make people forget about the Depression. And we had a big parade down Main Street, and led by a hearse with a casket in it, and which Old Man Gloom was supposed to be riding. We got him down to the Huckins Hotel on the corner there, where we had a firing squad from the recruiting station to shoot Old Man Gloom, and we placed him back in the casket, and we received a lot of publicity from that stunt. It was carried in newspapers all over the country, and other advertising clubs, I understand, took up the idea and used part of it, or got the idea from our club here.
Do you remember by chance who was on that day?
A man by the name of Creel, we call him Doc Creel, was the Old Man Gloom. He was with the Southwestern Advertising Agency, which later became Tracy Locke Dawson Advertising Agency. And I believe Tracy Locke are still in existence in New York. They were, the last I heard.
Now that's beyond 1915, between 1915 and 1920. Were you still with John Deere?
No, I went to the Capper Publications. That was a chain of papers owned by Senator Capper of Kansas, and he had a paper here in Oklahoma, and he had about 16 or 17 other papers scattered around over the United States.
What was your paper?
Our paper was the Oklahoma Farmer, and my job on that paper was assistant advertising manager. Mr. John Fields, who was twice candidate for governor of Oklahoma, was our editor, and Mr. Morris Crowther, who later went to New York as advertising manager of the Household magazine, was our advertising manager here at that time. My job was assistant advertising manager.
Can you relate any of your experiences with that publication, or any of the, possibly any of your farm observations of having been with a farm publication?
Well, it's about that time that I was secretary-treasurer of the Oklahoma City Advertising Club, and I was also a member of the Kiwanis came along about somewhere along that period, and I was a member of that club, member of the Manufacturers and Jobbers Club, member of the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce, and in my capacity as assistant advertising manager, I did considerable traveling in Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas and Louisiana for our papers. And I recall one time on one of my trips, I went to Galveston, and on that trip we were always instructed to go to the best hotels in town, and in those days we traveled largely by train. We were instructed to ride always in a Pullman car, never ride in a day coach. Go to the best hotel in town, eat the best eating places of the city where we were. So on one of my trips, I was just a young sprout starting out. I went to Galveston, what the Galvez Hotel, the main hotel at that time. I stayed 3 or 4 days there, attended to my business in Galveston, and when I went to check out, I found out my credit card, the credit card we had with the hotel had expired just a few days before that. So I asked the manager of the hotel, should I pay him or what should I do about it? He said, no, just go ahead, because we'll be getting another credit card from your company pretty soon, just forget it. Well, I thought that was pretty nice, and I was making a trip through Arkansas at the same time, and I went to Hot Springs, Arkansas. The Majestic Hotel was a big hotel there at the time. Well, I stayed there 2 or 3 days and took the baths and finished my business, and when I started to leave, I told Mr. Jones, who was the manager of the hotel, I said, Mr. Jones, my card expired a few days ago. I'll just have to pay this bill. He said, no, said, forget about it. Says, your company's good for credit here, and you folks just travel through here all the time on those cards, and says, it's all right. Says, we'll have a new card pretty soon, and you don't need to pay. So that was when I was cutting my ITs as a young traveling fellow, and learning some of the ins and outs of what it was like to get around in those days. I later, after the Oklahoma Farmer sold out, Mr. Senator Capper moved our advertising manager to New York, and wanted to move me there, and I didn't want to go to New York. So we dickered around for some time, and finally they said to me, well, just what salary will it take to get you to go to New York? And I said, Senator, you just can't name the salary that I'd go to New York. I said, I just wouldn't live in New York. I want to stay in Oklahoma. So that's when I left the Capra publication, and a short time after that joined with the Buick division of General Motors as zone advertising manager for the Buick division of General Motors. And I stayed there until I began to work for Norick in 1932.
During the 1920s, what can you recall as being outstanding events in Oklahoma City, either from the standpoint of their significance or from humorous or other type standpoints, other general events that may have occurred in Oklahoma City?
Gosh, it'd be hard for me to remember what happened in 1920s. This, as you know, was a fast-moving, fast-growing place at that time, and a fellow had to move fast to keep from getting run over.
Well, let's take things that happened in the 1920s. There was a lot of building in the 20s. The two big banks, the OG&E building and many other big buildings were built during the 1920s downtown. Why don't we talk about the building during the 1920s?
There was much building going on, and at that time I lived on Northwest 27th Street, up near Hudson and 27, and many times I would walk to work downtown, and from 27th Street on down to 16th Street was a prairie, no buildings. But about that period of time, they began to build residential areas out in there, and all that soon built up all through there. I remember we used to ride, when we did ride, we rode streetcars out there. There was a streetcar line ran up Chartel to 27th Street, and we'd ride that. And at one time, during a cold winter blizzard, Mr. Parker, a gentleman we knew, coming from work one night, he'd worked late, he got off the streetcar over there and started home through the snow and was lost and close to death at about where 23rd Street and North Walker is now. That was somewhere along in that period of time.
Can you think of the building now? The two banks were built about the same time, toward the end of the 1920s. Does their construction or any other construction remind you of any experiences in town? Maybe worth mentioning.
Yes, sir. On where the First National is now, there used to be a livery stable, and that livery stable had a building, as I recollect, a one-story building and a basement beneath it. And in the early days, about 1918 to 20 or somewhere along in there, I used to drive my Model T Ford downtown sometimes, and we would park it in that basement of that livery stable there. And that was one thing I remember about that location. And of course, Main Street, there were a number of new buildings going up on Main Street. There were a number, the city was going on towards the north and northwest, mainly, it seemed to me at that time, as I recollect, as far as residential area was concerned. And I remember one time along in there, somewhere, the river got up and cut Oklahoma City completely off from Capitol Hill. And for 2 or 3 days, there was no way to get from Oklahoma City to Capitol Hill except to walk across the Santa Fe Railroad Bridge, across the river. don't remember the date of that, no.
Who would you say were, over the period of time that you've been in Oklahoma City, who would you name as the outstanding leaders of Oklahoma City? I realize in a city this size this is very difficult to do, but over the years, what names do you think stand out in the history of Oklahoma City and you think maybe in the future?
Well, I'd say Mr. Ed Overholser was one of the greatest fellows I knew about that time. Mr. E.K. Gaylord of the Oklahoma Publishing Company, Mr. Jack Owen of the Oklahoma Gas and Electric Company. I remember all those fellows, especially Mr. William J. Petty of the Petty Hardware Company was a great booster of the city. And, of course, there were Mr. John A. Brown and Mr. Kerr, who had the Kerr Dry Goods Company at that time. They were all great. Them and many more, of course, were the fellows who helped build the town and make a great city out of it, and I remember them especially.
Now, when was John A. Brown started?
John A. Brown was originally Brock Dry Goods Company, and I don't remember what the date was that John A. Brown took over, but he took over there from Sidney L. Brock.
As a department store.
At a department store.
What was it over there?
Same place. And John Newbern was their advertising manager. George Summey was an advertising manager preceding John Newbern at Sidney L. Brock. Mr. Summey, I believe, still lives here in Oklahoma City. He's an insurance man.
What can you say about the advertising club during the 1920s?
Well, that was, as I said a while ago, that was the main club in the city. And some of these others had started in then, and some of the members joined other clubs, and the advertising club began to recruit some of the younger generation, and it was very, very active. We went along there for quite a while, and we had later they formed a women's advertising club, and for a long time we had two advertising clubs here in Oklahoma City. The ladies club lasted for several years, and then they rejoined the men's club. At that time, most of the advertising managers were men. The department store managers were men. Very few women in the positions of advertising heads in the stores were men. And that situation prevailed, well, I'd say up until that time in many lines of business.
Who were leaders in the advertising business during the 1920s?
Well, C.T. Walker of Harbor Longmire was one, and Locke, Raymond Locke of the Southwestern Advertising Agency, and Shelley Tracy was president of the club. Shelley was of the Tracy Locke Dawson outfit, and of course I mentioned a while ago that Joe Dawson was one time president too, and Morris Crowther of the Oklahoma Farmer was president one time, and the Keeshan brothers of Keeshan Advertising Agency, they were very active in the club. And we had two or three pretty good advertising agencies here at that time.
What was it? Tell about those advertising agencies.
Well, of course, the Southwestern Agency.
Is that the first one?
That was the first one. Well, I mean, the Keeshan brothers might have been a year or two ahead of them, I don't recall. But Keeshan and Southwestern Advertising Agency and Brown Connery Advertising Agency. They were the principal ones in town at that time. And they worked hard at the job, and they were all good advertising men, every one of them. And we had some fine advertising men here at that time. I remember Tom Fay, who was advertising manager of the Kerr Dry Goods Company, was one of the finest writers, copywriters that I've ever heard of, ever known. And in all of his newspaper advertising of the Kerr store, he refused to quote competitive prices. He never quoted prices in any of his ads. And he was a brilliant writer, and his language was something that was just out of this world, and people read his ads just for the pure delight of the language that he used. Had fellows of that type in a number of those places. And John Newbern, who was the advertising manager of the John A. Brown Company, for many years he was the one who conducted the elections at the advertising club. And it got to be a standing joke after a few years that when John got up to preside at the election of officers, he would always say, "Well, you folks that haven't finished eating, just go right ahead. We're going to elect some officers here." And that got to be a kind of a byword with the club at that time.
We've just been talking with Mr. Roy Evans, advertising manager of Norick Brothers and one of the old-time advertising men in Oklahoma City. Thank you very much, Mr. Evans. This is Penn Woods. I'm interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The date is June 25th, 1970. I'm in the Lieutenant Governor's office in the state capitol interviewing Lieutenant Governor George Nye of Oklahoma. George, I wonder if you could tell us where you were born and a little bit about your family background.
Well, I was born in McAlester, Oklahoma, June the 9th, 1927. I was the fourth son of Mr. and Mrs. Wilbur Nye. My mother's maiden name was Irene Crockett. My family was later added to with the addition of a sister, Mary Nye. So I was the fourth son in a family of five with a younger sister. My parents, Wilbur Nye, came from a Missouri farm. He ran away from home at the age, I believe, the best I remember, 13, and came to Oklahoma. And as he grew up, finished growing up here, making his own living, he later met and married my mother, Irene Crockett. My mother's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Lewin Crockett, owned a grocery store in McAlester, and after my dad and mother were married, he became a partner in the grocery store. So I was raised in McAlester, in a neighborhood grocery family, attended McAlester Public Schools, graduating from there in 1945.
A lot of people today are not familiar with the neighborhood grocery. The people growing up today certainly are not. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the neighborhood grocery as you saw it from the inside.
Well, I think it's particularly interesting, keeping in mind that the shopping cart, which revolutionized the grocery and merchandising business, was invented and manufactured first here in Oklahoma City. Prior to the shopping cart, it's hard for anyone to imagine what the grocery store might have been like unless they were actually there. It was a small building in the neighborhood with no more than, well, I think there were only 2 aisles. In fact, there was no need for an aisle because the customers themselves did not shop in the store. The merchandise would have been put on the shelf by the owner of the store, and you stood behind the counter, and a customer would come in to the neighborhood store and ask for a certain item. Now, other than like the staples of bread and milk and etc. that everyone would immediately know where they were, the customer would stand and say, like for example, I need a can of spinach, and the proprietor would then turn and walk from the counter to the shelf, get the can of spinach, bring it back, and then the customer would say, I need a can of corn. The proprietor or the worker would turn and walk in. So there's no such thing as a help yourself complex, but where the people in the community came and as always, almost all on credit, some good, some bad, incidentally, but almost always on credit, and no self-service. And if you can imagine, it was the days of the old pickle barrel. I started out that way in the cracker jar where they came individually. So or came in bulk rather than individually prepared. So I grew up in that sort of an influence, and it was a credit delivery store, and that also in this day and age, the delivery service was something that kept the neighborhood stores really alive for years longer than credit did. That was the availability to deliver to the customer who never really had to leave home. And so many times to customers who in today's age go to the store once a week perhaps and really buy a large amount of groceries, maybe in many cases just once a month, and just pick up a few items from then on. When I grew up delivering groceries in a neighborhood store, I would be at a customer's house as many as 3 times a day, as they only ordered for that day, and we would deliver it to them.
The principal thing I would like to visit with you about, George, the 3 basic areas. One, I'd like to talk a little about the JCs. During the period you were active in the JCs, and because I know it had quite an influence upon you, and and many of your friends in the JCs were active in your early campaigns, and some still are. A second is the legislative period, the period that you served in the legislature, and then the third is your period as lieutenant governor. Why don't we start off talking about the JCs, the McAllister JCs, and then the Oklahoma State JCs?
Well, I think that most people would first have to be aware that in Oklahoma particularly, the JCs, as it used to be known as the Junior Chamber of Commerce, played a very vital role in the growth of a lot of young men in their communities. Being an age bracket of 21 to 36, it was a natural place that anyone who wanted to take civic interest, but who was not ready for a leadership position in, let's say, Rotary or Lions, Kiwanis, etc., could move into the JC. And with the national headquarters here in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma noted as the young man's capital of the world, it would be quite logical that any young man wanting to be active in civic affairs would join the JC. That's exactly what I did. At age 22, I joined the McAllister JCs in McAllister. In McAllister, I joined them and became active on the state and national and international level over a period of years. Actually, the tenure of a man's activity in JCs probably would average out about 2.5 years. Some lasting only a few months, some lasting for many years. In my case, my activity in the JCs really extended over a great number of years, probably above and beyond, or with rare exception, anybody else in Oklahoma. Because when I started at 22, I then continued through the national and international level because I became executive director of a world meeting that would be held in Oklahoma City. So my age bracket was extended because world JCs, the age is 40. So over a period of about 18 years, I was active in the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And another reason why it was extended is that I would participate in local activities, and then my activity in the legislature would prevent me from participating. And so I was come and go JC member for so many years. But the JCs have meant a great deal to me personally. My closest friends, my closest political supporters came from this group at one time.
Thinking in terms of the McAllister JCs during the period you were with them or the period that you observed them, can you give any of the highlights of projects that took place, Mr. Sinai?
Well, I think I would point out, we were talking a minute ago about how the neighborhood groceries changed into the supermarket. I think it also would say how the JCs have changed in their projects. Used to, it was completely limited to city parks, the youth park, cleaning up Main Street, putting on a good carnival, something like that. Then as it evolved through the years, JCs became also issue-oriented in government and activity. So back when I first was involved in JCs, I found myself actively learning how to make my community a better community by being involved in this project. For example, I know that we had several youth parks built, physically built by the JCs as well as financially. We were involved in pageants like Speak Up for Democracy, or it used to be called the Voice of Democracy, where we encouraged all high school students to participate in oratorical contests about their country. We participated in a typical JC project would be the Christmas program, where you'd bring in the underprivileged children to see Santa Claus and have their gifts. All of these projects were meaningful projects, and one that kept you involved in the community. Then the JCs began getting a little more firm in their stand and thinking, well, there were other things, there were other communities bigger than their own hometown, and so they got involved in other issues, such as statewide projects assisting state government. I know that a very minor one, but I thought meaningful one, was the state magazine Oklahoma Today. It almost went under 3 or 4 times because of lack of support, and JCs always rallied to the cause, and now we have one of the finest state magazines anywhere in the country. And on even further into statewide mental health programs, and statewide, just recently, the Rub Out Rubella program that the JCs are involved in. So I would say that the projects have gone from all the way from keep the city streets clean to trying to have a voice in a constitutional convention. So you could take the whole gamut there on JC projects.
On the state level, what are some of the outstanding individual projects that you might think of, or some of the outstanding experiences that you might think of in terms of the organization itself?
Well, pretty difficult for me to think back of the projects that I thought the state most actively participated in, most outstanding, back a few years, because I'm kind of centered around their activities to host the international convention, international congress as they call it. And my last 4 or 5 years in the JCs was, those 5 years were devoted to the securing of and the carrying out the JCI World Congress, when we had young men and women from some 70 countries of what was known as the free world come to Oklahoma City for their annual meeting. I think this was most significant because we were proud that, one, we had to become the bid city for the United States JCs. And in other words, the United States only submitted one town, one city that could be considered for the site. So we first had to bid against other cities in the United States, against New Orleans, and Baltimore, and Los Angeles, and New York City, and Miami, Florida, for example. And we convinced the USJCs that if they wanted the world young men and women to come in and see America, that they couldn't come just to New York and see the World's Fair and go home and say they'd seen America, or come to Los Angeles and see Disneyland and say they'd seen America, or New Orleans and see the French Quarter and say they'd seen America. But instead we convinced the USJCs to invite them to the heartland of what we consider the true, typical America, which would be the inland away from the coast. And so they came here. I mean, they submitted Oklahoma City. And then we had to go to the world meeting and bid against the world capitals. against Rio de Janeiro, against Montreal, Canada, against some of the other glamour cities of the world. And so I would think one of the most meaningful things that I've ever been involved in is just the simple thing of getting a world meeting in Oklahoma, so that young men of the world could see what the image of Oklahoma really should be. And I thought that was the most meaningful project for our state.
Could you talk a little about the convention itself here?
Well, yes, they came from 70 countries. Every continent was represented. And interestingly enough, they came in their native dress on many occasions. Basically, they dressed Western style, but we had a couple events that we encouraged native dress, and it was most meaningful. The exchange of international ideas was most beneficial. Not only did they see America and see Oklahoma, but as you sit around the conference, handled like the United Nations, with people speaking their native tongue and you having to listen to an interpreter. In fact, there are 3 official languages in JCI, Junior Chamber International: French, English, and Spanish. So when you have an international meeting, you have simultaneous translation. And we had it like the United Nations, the sound booth and the listening booth and the earphones. And this gave you an appreciation. You know, we sit around here and we think that everybody's like that. If you really stop and think about it, we're just a very small percentage of the world's population. And our race is the minority race. So our country is certainly the minority country. So you see what the rest of the world is truly like. The other thing that was important about the World Congress is to keep in mind that in about 5 to 10 years after a JC meeting, those young men will have moved up the line, moved up the ladder, and will be in important positions within their country as well as within their civic activities. There were no major issues that I could discuss at the World Congress because they stressed mainly projects that are non-political, so that their governments aren't involved in conflict with each other. So it's really just an interchange of ideas about how to make your community and your country a more productive and more forceful place, but not too many activities that you would really consider international.
Moving to the Oklahoma Legislature, what was your first year of election to the legislature?
Okay, I was first elected in 1950, taking office in 1951.
Swinging back before we go into the political area, who are some of the outstanding personalities of leadership in the JCs during this period? I'm thinking statewide, during the period that you were active in the organization. Just name a few. You don't have to name them in any order or anything.
Well, there were so many. They go back different years, and I couldn't, of course, name them in order. But Charlie Ford, who is now a state representative from Tulsa, was a state president and extremely active in the JCs and the international organization. Wilson Smith, an attorney from Chickasha, was the first one who ever even had the idea that the JCs ought to be meeting in Oklahoma as an international convention. And I thought his leadership was extremely felt in the JC activities. My closest associate in the JC, my closest association was with Joe Johnson, who later became a judge on the Court of Criminal Appeals and served in the legislature, etc. In fact, he was my campaign manager in most of my statewide campaigns. He's now deceased, but the leadership that he gave to the JC, both including his term as president, but the influence that he gave prior to and after his service as president, was the most contributing force to the successful endeavor. I could go on and name various JCs. Lou Allard now in the legislature. Used to be active in the JCs as a state president, and there are several others. But, the one that I'd single out always would be Joe Johnson.
Swinging now into the legislative area, you first went in 1950 or 1952?
Well, the election, it's confusing. Election is always in the even years, and you take office in the odd years. So my election was in 50, and I took office in January 51. And I served 8 years to January of 1959.
Thinking as consecutively as you can, why don't, what were the issues, the major issues before the legislature in 1950 or during that first legislative term?
Well, the major issue has always been education and the finance of education and the finance in general. So I would think that I came to the legislature as a school teacher and was particularly interested in that field. The field of education was of particular interest to me. I came to the legislature as a high school history teacher, but I've noticed that if you just wanted to take it out chronologically, education was always the #1 issue facing the state. And it's not the issue of whether or not we want better schools, but it's the issue, a little more basic than that, is it's the financing. So if you really wanted to single out any time, any legislative session, what is the #1 issue? It's money. And how do you spend the money? How do you spend what you have, and how do you raise additional funds if you need them? Now, the educational program has come greatly with progress since 1950, and it's just been so rapid that it's almost unbelievable. But even at that, it's difficult to maintain the same rate of growth that some of the other states have. Well, I went through the issue of turnpikes, whether or not we need turnpikes in Oklahoma, and I, for one, am in favor of them. They were extremely controversial in the first few years of my legislative career, but that was about the only way at that time that Oklahoma was going to ever get 4-lane highways. And so I was strictly in favor of it. The repeal of prohibition kept coming up in my legislative career, but I never, it was not taken up during that time. It was later, but it was an issue in every campaign, and kept growing in such magnitude until it became so large that it was finally repealed. The problems that faced me as a legislator were concerned also with penal reform and penal appropriations. Being from McAllister, the state penitentiary, being located there were a great many needs for the prison program. And since they were prisoners and non-citizens, there were not too many people lobbying for them. And money was so tight and so hard that anytime you'd come up with a program for the prison, other legislators would, of course, start screaming and hollering that they had other programs that were far more worthy: crippled children, mentally retarded, the educational system, welfare, whatever it is. And the argument was, why should we be rewarding those prisoners when we can't take care of the good citizens of the state? So penal reform and penal financing was a major problem, and one with which I associated myself during my legislative career. The others, I would say, would be the normal, typical problems that any legislature would face. But basically, it always comes back to money.
The thinking in terms of your first session, first and second sessions, possibly, who are some of the personalities? Some of them may not still be around. Most of them probably not. But who are some of the personalities of leadership, or just personalities in general that you might single out in your early legislative career?
Well, I think that there are two names that just stick out like glaring examples of legislative leadership that almost anyone would have to mention them. And those are Jim Nance and J.D. Mccarty. Jim Nance served not only as Speaker of the House, but President Pro Tem of the Senate, and came back and served again as Speaker of the House. I've never seen anyone, and I use the term operate in its fullest sense, operate like Jim Nance did as Speaker of the House of Representatives. I liked him, and I appreciated his service. He was extremely controversial, but he gave a sense of purpose to the House of Representatives. It was always dominated, generally by the state Senate, as being the upper house. Being a House member, I admired the leadership that Jim Nance gave us just in unifying the House members into a body. But more than that, his stamp was branded on almost every major piece of legislation that was passed in the legislature. And he certainly had an influence on government through his power as Speaker and through his power of knowing those in high positions in state government. The other gentleman that stands out equally, I think, is J.D. Mccarty, equally controversial, but equally as strong and effective. J.D. Mccarty was known as a knothole gang boy. He was one of the outsiders, and his leadership ability was questioned all the time as a member just sitting out on the floor. He had the reputation of being someone who could kill legislation, but not someone who would pass legislation. And he tried many times to be Speaker of the House unsuccessfully. And then he became Speaker of the House, and many people who had sat on the side questioning his ability were extremely impressed with his ability to be the Speaker. And every major piece of legislation, again, bore the brand of J.D. Mccarty. Like I said, he was controversial, and he could pass legislation like a steamroller. Of course, when you're on his side, that's great. When you're against him, it was terrible. There again, I was one of those who probably would have questioned his leadership ability, but he certainly displayed it. And he and Jim Nance are the two most unforgettable men I've known in the legislature.
Going into the mid-50s, before your running for lieutenant governor, can you think of any other legislative highlights that might be worth mentioning, or any specific experiences that occurred on the legislative floor that might be of either some significance, or possibly of humorous incidents, or possibly some sidelights that might be of interest to people listening?
Well, of the personal sidelights concerned my age, because being 22, I was the youngest member of the House and looked even younger than that, and was mistaken many times for a page and asked to run errands and give a note. I was refused my paycheck and this sort of thing, because they always thought I was not a member, but they thought I was a page. This would be employees in other parts of the building. So the funny things that happened to me generally happened to me because of my youth and my youthful looking. I think that the thing I noticed, as you talked about the mid-50s, was that was really when the legislature became of age. We'd gone through an era of irresponsibility, I think, in the legislature. During the war, the legislature was kind of tolerated by people. And then after the war, you came along with a burst of everybody trying to take care of the social programs. Colleges were bursting at the seams. The grade schools were just literally not adequate at all. The highway program suddenly was sitting there with 2-lane roads, and everybody now could afford automobiles, and there were bottlenecks all over the state on the highway program. And the legislature suddenly had to get down to serious business and became of age. The character of the legislature changed, the makeup, the personality, and you started seeing more responsibility. There again, I was one of those who probably would have questioned his leadership ability, but he certainly displayed it. And he colleges were bursting at the seams. The grade schools were just literally not adequate at all. The highway program suddenly was sitting there with 2-lane roads, and everybody now could afford automobiles, and there were bottlenecks all over the state on the highway program. And the legislature suddenly had to get down to serious business and became of age. The character of the legislature changed, the makeup, the personality. And you started seeing more responsible men